I wanted to do some more video essays specifically on British science fiction, and V for Vendetta counts because on so many levels it's very, very, very poor. But it does seem to fit the bill because it's based on the Alan Moore graphic novel released in the 1980s, which was an allegory about fascism during the Thatcher years. And what can I say about the adaptation? Well, I think the nicest thing you can say about it is they took some of the major plot events and just turned it into a very formulaic superhero story. So a lot of the rough edges that you found in the graphic novel are completely lost. And I just don't like Natalie Portman in the main role. I don't mind Natalie Portman. I think she's a very talented actress, but wow, just as a British woman, I don't believe her. The accent is just horrific. I just could not believe for a single second this person grew up in Britain or even knew anything about British culture. It was just a very, very poor translation. And I understand why they got Hugo because he's from The Matrix. And this is from the directors of The Matrix, and they're producing this, but it just felt all around a very, very weak translation of the comic. So I'd recommend reading the comic first before seeing this, but then I'd recommend the comic because the comic has such higher quality. But it is functional. I'd have to give it a 6.5. I do recommend it. It is done well in certain places in terms of the costumes and the sets, and it does functionally get from A to B, but it's a very weak recommendation because it does have so many problems and so many issues. The novel was about the issue of anarchism versus fascism, and it tried to present both of them as compelling kind of philosophies facing off against one another in Britain, and had a very well thought out kind of world building in terms of British science fiction, in terms of British dystopia. And so it's a very good addition to sort of that tradition of George Orwell in 1984. And this really does not follow it almost in any single way. Since I'm not British, I don't know how much of the authenticity of the settings or the locations is really matching up to real life, but it just didn't feel like any real place. And that's also very different with the novel. It felt like a really well-rounded universe, and again, yes, obviously they had a lot more time to do it, but you don't see that many places in the novel, but nevertheless he was able to fill it out quite well. And this just feels very skimpy. We just have a few locations, the V headquarters, the fascists being killed off in their homes, and a few other shots, sort of a British television station. That's about it. There's really not much creativity or engagement with the setting. It's sort of just very functional, paint by numbers approach, and the characters are just so paper thin. V just hates the government. And he hates the government presumably because he's a lesbian or a trans he's something. And yes, there is that ambiguity in the novel, but here it's just so sledgehammer. The government hates Muslims, they hate atheists, they hate la 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 la. It's just, there's no rhyme, there's no poetry, it's very, very full frontal, and there's no reason anybody would follow this government. It's just, are the people this stupid? Do they not care about their freedom? It's just very, very not well communicated why or how the government is able to control people. Whereas in the novel, it's very, very well laid out in terms of how the government is able to use propaganda and why at least it's plausible that they're able to maintain control. But this is just so childish in almost every single way. It's kind of hard to follow or even pay attention or even be interested when you have the final confrontations and V takes out a lot of these villains, which we know he will because he now has tons of superpowers, which he never did in the original graphic novel. He's very, very human in the novel, and he can be very, very hurt very easily. Whereas here, they shoot him a couple times and he just shrugs it off, and it's like, okay, interesting. So I am recommending it because at least it was well intentioned. I don't believe Alan Moore where they think they're perverting his work, but I do agree with him that they basically kind of missed the major philosophical emphasis where they just do this very weak retread of basically the government is a kind of neocon government. And I have nothing good to say about neoconservatism. I do think it is very much close to neo-fascism. So politically, I have no issue with how they're framing things, but really it's just, okay, so you have a couple of allusions to the Bush administration and obviously their torture regime, but beyond that, what do you have to say? Not much of anything. And I thought it was really strange for British science fiction. It just completely skips over Thatcher. There's almost no allusions to the Thatcher period. I'm just like, why would you take that out? Just how extreme the politics were in the early 1980s. It was really, really scary. Where it was very plausible that Britain could have turned into a fascist state. But here we don't see any of that urgency or why the novel was able to generate a lot of the interest it did in the 1980s. So it's a very sincere effort. The performances are mostly fine, but there's really nothing standing out in terms of energy or creativity, and the direction is just so plodding and just so simplistic. It's just is like you're just waiting for the whole thing to finally wrap up and finish. But the source material is powerful enough. I would recommend this just to get kind of an introduction into the world, and they do spoil some major plot events, unfortunately, from the novel, but they actually don't touch most of the novel. Like, huge amounts of the dialogue, huge amounts of scenes, huge amounts of characterization are never really used. So thankfully, they really didn't touch most of the novel, so you can enjoy the comic book on its own terms and really not really care about the movie itself. But it was a sincere effort, so I give them points on that. I think they were trying to be sincere, but yeah, it's just a little too direct. The allegories don't make a lot of sense, and Natalie Portman, I just don't buy for a minute as a British woman. I just could not conceive of a worse choice to get. I understand why they did it because she's a big fan favorite. I know a lot of fans of science fiction really like her, but I think they just really should have chosen somebody else. So it's just dragging in too many places. I'll recommend it, but it's not a very strong recommendation. But there you have it. That a review of V for Vendetta, a very sincere but unfortunately lackluster entry into British science fiction. Thanks for listening.